Before I talk about what I want to talk about as far as tax, let's just recap again. We always try to recap at the beginning of each part. So let's just kind of recap part 1 through 4. We talked about in part 1, we talked about a brief history of the LLC and why it was important to understand this information that I parsed from the brief history. You don't know where you're going if you don't know, where something has been. So the brief history talks about how we, as the US, became very interested, engaged, and then eventually established the LLC structure. We talked about how new that is, how fresh it is, how young it is. We talked about how the body of law surrounding an LLC is still developing and why that's important for you to know, how that can affect you presently and in the future. We went over really quickly the different type of business entities in which you can provide a product or service, whether it's a business entity that you register with the Secretary of State or a business entity that you don't have to register with the Secretary of State. So we talked about that as well. We talked about what an LLC is. We kind of touched on it in part 2, but we really focused on in part 2 the reasons why you should think about forming an LLC or another type of business entity, the type of questions you should ask yourself, and depending on those answers, where does it push you to? Don't just form an LLC because it seems easy possibly in your state, or because everyone has one, or you just think that's where you need to establish. And that goes for any business entity. Don't form a corporation without knowing, if that's what you need. Don't form a limited partnership without knowing if that's what you need. So you want to ask yourself questions and answer those, and we kind of touched on what some of those questions were. And then in part 3, we started to talk about the proper formation of an LLC. We talked about how the state looks at the LLC, regards the LLC, in comparison to who you are as an individual. We talked about some of the procedures that your state may require in order for you to actually establish it. We also talked about in part 4, when you form it after it's established, or if it was already an established entity, some of the things you need to think about when you're communicating the control or managers or members. We talked about the difference between member managed and manager managed. We talked about all of that in part 4. We talked about the operating agreement that was introduced in part 4, was an operating agreement, and how it's important for you to have an operating agreement that reflects your company, reflects how you operating, the products and services that you offer, the individuals that may be involved, who are currently involved, that you foresee being involved, or if it's just you as a sole member. We talked about how you need to see yourself as a separate legal entity.